Anti-nationals, they're everywhere. Every day, a party spokesperson or a TV show host identifies more of them, but even they won't tell you the true extent of anti-national activity. Today, it's my turn to expose the original anti-nationals and the history of the foreign hand that supports them. The word anti-national has been popular in this country once before. During the emergency, it was used to target dissenters and activists who challenged the government, especially when they worked with donors, intellectuals, and journalists overseas to expose the misuse of power. It's a history we're not taught, the history of denunciation. And it leaves you with a question. Does the word anti-national tell you more about the people who are being accused or the people who are making the accusation? One politician who loves to call people anti-national is Subramaniam Swamy. And he should know, when he was younger, that's what the government called people like him. Swamy is an MP in the Rajya Sabha, and he's been in and out of parliament since 1974, the year before Indira Gandhi declared a state of emergency. When that happened, in June of 1975, thousands of opposition activists from both the left and the right were immediately put in jail. Others went underground. Some organized resistance to the emergency from inside India, and others went overseas. Swamy was one of those who escaped censorship and jail by taking their activism abroad. In his own words, non-resident Indians were horrified at the slander by the present regime against the opposition. They needed dissident voices to come and help them understand what was really going on. So in December of 1975, he flew to London. And he entered an international network which was campaigning with Western governments, journalists, and intellectuals to expose the hijack of power in India. They called themselves smugglers of truth, and their main weapon against the government of India was negative press. Early on, the New York Times and the Times of London carried ads that demanded the release of JP, the leader of the opposition, who was in jail. It was signed by Western intellectuals and mostly left-leaning public figures. Today, the right wing is outraged by critical coverage in foreign press, but in 1976, it was Swamy who was speaking to the Times and a dozen other papers to brief them about the threat to Indian democracy. Because of this advocacy, the US Congress would hold hearings about civil liberties in India, and similar questions were asked in the British House of Commons. The Hindutva leader M.G. Chitkara claimed that overseas activism was one of the decisive factors that upset the calculations of the dictatorial regime here. That means it brought international pressure on Indira Gandhi, which probably helped to bring emergency to an end in 1977. What's more interesting, though, was Indira Gandhi's reaction. And it'll sound familiar to anyone who follows the news today. The PM accused international news outlets of foreign interference. In 1976, Indian embassies were told to compile a blacklist of Indians who indulged in anti-national and unpatriotic activities, which really just meant opposing the emergency. Swamy came in for special attention. In September of 1976, a Rajya Sabha committee was formed to investigate Swamy, who was still a member of the House. Its verdict was that he had carried out activities in collusion with anti-India elements abroad to malign our democratic institutions and to provide fuel to the fire of anti-India propaganda by the external enemies of our country. Let's look at that sentence again. Focus on these three phrases: anti-India elements, anti-India propaganda, and external enemies. These are words we now hear on news debates every day, and they're still being used to make critics of the government look like enemies of the country. The emergency was a watershed for transnational activism, especially for the Hindu right. It forced activists to find new bases, funders, and media support abroad, and to try and influence Western governments and agencies against the regime in Delhi. Yet when the emergency ended, those linkages didn't. They continued as a widening stream of foreign advocacy and funding to the Sangh, and it continues today. According to some reports, the RSS has received millions of dollars in overseas funding, much of it from foreign citizens. Constantly we hear these days that critics of the BJP government are foreign-sponsored. In fact, if any political force has been fostered and supported by foreign activism in recent decades, it's Hindu nationalism. Very little in history is completely new, and the phrase anti-national is definitely not. When these phrases come back, we should try and understand them in the light of how they came up before. Words like anti-national, anti-India, and foreign hand, they were the vocabulary of the emergency regime in 1976, used against people demanding democracy. Today, A new party is in power, but it's using the same language against its critics. The words themselves mean nothing. What do Subramaniam Swamy and Arundhati Roy have in common? Not much, but the governments that accuse them, that's something to think about.
To receive instant updates on all videos from The Wire, click the subscribe button and hit the bell icon. Pay to support independent journalism. Click the link in the description and choose the amount you want to pay.